The desert doesn't forgive mistakes. It doesn't care who you are, what you've done, or how hard you've prayed. It just takes your water, your strength, your will, and when there's nothing left, it takes your life too. The men who understood this survived. The ones who didn't were buried in unmarked graves scattered across 1,000 miles of red Texas earth. Elias Cord understood the desert. He'd been riding these flats for 23 years, long enough to read the sky like scripture, long enough to know when the land was warning him. And on the morning of September 4, 1874, as he guided his horse through a dry creek bed 10 miles south of his ranch, the land was screaming. He almost didn't stop. He saw the shape first, small, crumpled, pressed against the base of a limestone outcropping like something discarded. His horse shied. Elias tightened the reins. His hand moved instinctively to the rifle across his saddle. In this country, in this year, with the Comanche raids burning through the Texas frontier like wildfire, a man who stopped for unknown shapes in the dirt was often a man who didn't ride home. He stopped anyway. She was maybe 12 years old. Comanche. Her face was a mask of dried blood, her lips split from the heat, her breathing so shallow he almost missed it. Around her neck hung a cord of painted beads, red and black, the kind that meant something important to her people. Her hands were curled against her chest like she'd been trying to hold herself together. Every voice in Elias Cord's head told him to ride on. Every year of frontier living, every story he'd heard about what happened to men who got tangled in Comanche business. Every scar his own land carried from raid and fire, all of it screamed at him to put his spurs down and keep moving. He climbed down from his horse. He didn't know it then, but that single decision, that small, quiet act of mercy in the middle of nowhere, was about to change everything. His ranch. His neighbors. His life. Because 3 days later, 50 Comanche warriors surrounded his land at dawn. And some of them wanted him dead. Elias Cord was not a man you'd notice in a crowd. He was lean in the way that hard living makes a man lean, not from vanity but from years of burning more than he could eat. His face was the color of saddle leather, mapped with lines that told stories he never spoke out loud. His eyes were a pale, washed-out gray that sat still in his skull the way only the eyes of men who've seen genuine violence can sit still, not cold exactly, but settled. Unshockable. Like two stones at the bottom of a clear river. He was 41 years old and he'd been in Texas since he was 18, which meant he'd arrived just in time to fight in the worst of it. The Mexican campaigns. The Ranger skirmishes. 3 years of riding with a company that operated in the spaces between law and lawlessness where nobody asked too many questions and nobody gave too many answers. He'd done things in those years that he didn't put names to anymore. Things that had grown a hard shell around the softer parts of him, not killed those parts, just buried them under callous and silence. He'd built his ranch on 300 acres of broken limestone country in Palo Pinto County. The land wasn't beautiful. It was stubborn and ungenerous, all cedar scrub and pale rock and thin brown grass, but it was his. He'd run cattle on it, not many enough. He had a stone house, 2 good corrals, a well that had never gone dry, and a hired hand named Samuel. A freedman from Louisiana who could shoe a horse faster than anyone Elias had ever seen and who spoke fewer words per day than even Elias did, which was saying something considerable. There was no wife. There had been once, a woman named Clara who'd lasted 2 winters before deciding that loneliness and wind and the constant low-grade fear of Comanche raids were not the life she'd signed up for. She'd gone back east, and Elias had not argued with her, because he understood. He understood completely. This country asked too much. He'd made his peace with solitude. What he had not made peace with was 1874 itself, which was shaping up to be one of the bloodiest years the frontier had seen in a decade. The Red River War had the army pushing hard against the Southern Plains tribes, driving them off their ranges, burning their winter food supplies, killing their horses. The Comanche, who had owned this land longer than any white man could imagine, were being systematically destroyed, not all at once, but piece by piece. In the way that's harder to bear than a single clean blow. The raids in response had been savage. 3 ranches burned within 40 miles of Elias's property in August alone. A family named Kettner, 2 children included, found dead in their yard. A freighter ambushed on the Weatherford Road. The army was spread thin, the rangers thinner. Every man on the frontier was sleeping light and keeping his rifle loaded. So when Elias found the girl in the dry creek bed, the world around him was already drawn tight as a wire. He pulled her out of the sun first, getting her under the shadow of the limestone shelf, and he gave her water, slow, careful, a little at a time from his canteen, tilting it against her cracked lips and watching her throat work. She didn't wake. Her breathing evened slightly. Her skin was burning, not sun fever, something deeper. Infection maybe, or a sickness that had been working at her for days. He studied her for a long moment. The beads around her neck. The pattern on her moccasins, geometric, precise, the kind of craftwork that took hours. Her hair was cut shorter on one side, ragged, like it had been done in grief or anger. He'd seen enough Comanche to know she wasn't a captive. She was Comanche herself, through and through. He looked at the horizon in every direction. Empty. That particular, absolute emptiness of the Texas flats that could hide an army if the army wanted to hide. He could leave her here with water and ride away. Someone might find her. She might recover. The desert might take her, but that would be the desert's sin, not his. He could ride away clean. Elias Cord bent down, picked her up, and laid her across his saddle. She weighed almost nothing. That was what struck him hardest, how little she weighed. Like she was already half gone, already dissolving back into the dry air. He held her steady with one arm and led his horse by the reins, walking the 3 miles back toward his ranch because riding double over rough ground might shake something loose in her that couldn't be fixed. He walked those 3 miles in the September heat, sweating through his shirt, talking to the girl in a low voice even though she couldn't hear him. Not saying anything important. Just making sound. The way you talk to a spooked horse. Just letting her know through some animal frequency below language that she wasn't alone. Samuel was at the corral when Elias came through the gate. He looked at the girl. He looked at Elias. He said nothing for a long moment, which was Samuel's way of saying a great many things. "She's burning up," Elias said. Samuel nodded once. "I'll get water boiling." They brought her inside the stone house and laid her on Elias's own bed. He cleaned the wound he found on her side, a deep gash, days old, poorly cleaned, the edges red and swollen with early infection. He'd done field surgery on men in conditions worse than this. He packed the wound with what he had. He got more water into her. By nightfall, her fever had climbed higher. Samuel sat by the window with his shotgun across his knees, watching the dark. Elias sat by the bed, watching the girl breathe. Neither man spoke about what this meant. What it could bring down on them. What might already be moving through the dark toward their small circle of lamplight. They didn't need to say it. They both already knew. She broke the fever on the second night. Elias was half asleep in the chair beside the bed when he heard her breathing change, the shallow, desperate rhythm giving way to something deeper, slower. He came fully awake immediately, the way men do when they've trained themselves not to sleep hard. He put the back of his hand to her forehead. The burning had dropped. Not gone, but manageable. The infection in her side was still angry and red, but it hadn't gone septic, which meant she had a fighting chance. He sat back and let out a breath he felt like he'd been holding for 48 hours. In the gray light of that second dawn, he got his first real look at her face. She was older than he'd first estimated, maybe 14 or 15, not 12. Her features were sharp and fine. Even hollowed out by sickness, there was a quality of composure about her face, a certain set to her jaw that spoke of someone who'd been raised not to show pain easily. There was a scar along her left eyebrow, old and silver white, the kind that comes from a childhood fall. She looked, Elias thought, like someone's daughter. Like someone was missing her the way the ground misses rain. He was outside splitting cedar for the stove when Samuel came to the door of the house and said quietly, "She's awake." Elias went inside. She was sitting up in the bed, her back against the stone wall, her dark eyes absolutely still and absolutely watchful. She had the blanket pulled up in one hand and she was tracking every corner of the room, every object, every possible exit, not panicking, just assessing. The methodical observation of someone raised to survive. When her eyes reached Elias, they stopped. He held up both hands, palms out, and stayed in the doorway. He spoke 3 words of Comanche, the extent of his vocabulary. That meant roughly, "You are safe." His pronunciation was probably terrible. She didn't react to the words, but she watched his hands, and the hands seemed to mean something. He brought her water and dried meat, and set them on the chair beside the bed and stepped back. She didn't touch the food for a long time. Just watched him. Then, slowly, she reached for the water and drank. The eating came after, careful, measured, not the desperate consumption of someone half-starved but the controlled intake of someone who'd been taught that information mattered more than comfort. She was learning this room. Learning him. He tried speaking to her in Spanish, which he had reasonable command of. The southern Comanche, the Penatica bands, often had some Spanish from decades of trading and raiding across the Rio Grande. He asked her name. She said nothing. He asked if she was in pain. Still nothing. He pointed to the wound on her side. He said in Spanish, "That was going to kill you. It is better now. Not healed, but better." Something moved through her eyes. Not gratitude, not yet. Calculation. She was deciding what kind of man he was. What his angle was. What the cost of this would be. He understood that perfectly. He would have done the same. He left her alone and went back outside. Samuel was at the far end of the corral, very still, shading his eyes against the morning light and looking east toward the ridge that ran along the property's edge. "What do you see?" Elias asked. "Nothing," Samuel said. "But—" Samuel lowered his hand. "Dust. Yesterday dust. Too far to tell." Elias looked at the ridge. The cedar and scrub oak along its spine were perfectly still in the windless morning air. But dust meant movement, and movement out here meant either cattle, and his cattle were all accounted for, or riders. "How many?" "More than 2, Samuel said. "Less than 20, maybe." Elias nodded. "Tonight we sleep in shifts." "Been sleeping in shifts," Samuel said, which was true. That evening the girl spoke for the first time. Elias was sitting at the table cleaning his colt when he heard her voice from the back room, low, steady, not a cry or a call but a deliberate statement. He went to the doorway. She was looking directly at him. She said a word in Comanche that he didn't know. Then she said it in Spanish, slowly, as if she wasn't certain he was smart enough to follow. The word was warrior. Then she said another word. "Father." Elias felt the back of his neck go cold. "Your father," he said carefully in Spanish. "He is a warrior." She held his gaze and said nothing, but her eyes confirmed it. "Does he know where you are?" She looked at him for a long, measuring moment. Then she said one more word, and this word she said in English, clean and clear, which told him immediately that someone had taught it to her deliberately, as a tool. "Soon," she said. Elias stood in the doorway of his own house and understood that the world had just shifted under his feet. Not like an earthquake. Earthquakes were sudden. This was slower. Like standing on riverbank ground that's been soaking through for days, and suddenly feeling the earth begin, very quietly, to give. He went back to the table and finished cleaning his colt. He loaded it. Then he cleaned the rifle, and loaded that too. Samuel appeared in the doorway from outside. He said nothing. He crossed to where his own shotgun hung on the wall and began checking the shells. In the back room, the girl lay down again. and the night outside the stone ranch house pressed in from every direction. Deep and dark and absolutely silent in the way that the Texas frontier is only silent when something in it is holding its breath. Her name was Tsina. She told him on the third morning, offered it without any warmth but without hostility either, the way you'd hand a man a tool. She was sitting up eating properly now, her color returning, the fever down to almost nothing. The wound in her side was closing clean, which was something close to a miracle given its condition when he'd found her. Elias received her name the same way she gave it. Like a fact. Through broken Spanish and patient repetition, the story came out in pieces over those morning hours. She was the daughter of a war chief, she did not give his name, and Elias didn't push, a chief whose band had been moving south ahead of the army's push through the staked plains. There had been a skirmish, not with soldiers but with a group of buffalo hunters who'd crossed into hunting grounds that weren't theirs to cross. Tsina had been separated from her group in the chaos, unhorsed, wounded by a hunter's knife when she'd gotten too close to the fighting. She'd walked for 2 days before she couldn't walk anymore. She said all of this without self-pity. Not performing toughness, just genuinely uninterested in the dramatics of it. She told it the way a soldier reports, what happened, what came next, what the current situation was. What the current situation was, her father would find her. Elias believed her entirely. He found himself in a position that had no clean answer, which was a position he'd occupied enough times in his life to recognize its specific discomfort. He had 3 choices as far as he could see them. First, he could try to get Tsina to somewhere her people might find her, ride out, leave her somewhere visible, give her his horse, and hope that was the end of it. Second, he could ride to Weatherford and put the problem in someone else's lap, the army, the sheriff, whoever wanted it, and watch it become something uglier than it needed to be. Because the moment Tsina went into army hands in 1874, she became a prisoner or a bargaining piece or something worse. Third, he could wait. He chose to wait. Partly because riding out with her might look like something it wasn't to whoever was watching from that ridge. Partly because she wasn't well enough yet to survive rough travel. But mostly because something in the way she'd said soon on that second night told him the waiting wouldn't be long either way. He was right. On the third afternoon, Samuel came inside from the yard walking fast, which Samuel almost never did. "Ryder," he said. "Coming straight in, no hesitation. He wants to be seen." Elias took his rifle and went outside. The rider was a young Comanche warrior, maybe 17, riding a pinto horse with the particular effortless quality of someone who'd been on horseback since before he could properly walk. He stopped his horse 40 yards from the house gate and simply waited. He was wearing paint, not full war paint, but enough to be a statement. He carried a lance and a rifle across his back. He was alone. Which meant he was an emissary. Which meant this was still the part of things where talking was possible. Elias walked out to the gate. He left the rifle inside, which cost him something, but he did it because leaving the rifle inside was itself a statement, and statements mattered more than anything right now. The young warrior looked at him without expression and said something in Comanche. Elias spread his hands. "Spanish," he said. "Español?" A pause. Then the warrior switched, imperfect but clear. "You have someone who belongs to us." "I have a girl who was dying in a creek bed," Elias said. "I brought her here and kept her alive. She is recovered. She can go home." The warrior's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes shifted. "My chief will come," he said. "Tomorrow. With the sunrise. You will have her at the gate." "She'll be there," Elias said. The warrior looked at him for a moment longer, the look of a young man who'd been told to deliver a message and was now deciding whether the man he delivered it to understood the full weight of it. "You will be there also," the warrior said. "My chief wishes to see the man who did this." "He's not the only one," Elias said. Something almost human crossed the young warrior's face, not quite amusement, but its ghost. Then he turned his horse and rode back the way he'd come, unhurried, disappearing into the cedar brakes along the eastern ridge. Samuel had been watching from the doorway. "Well?" Samuel said. "Yeah," said Elias. That night, Sina called him into the room. She was sitting cross-legged on the bed, and she had unbraided and rebraided her hair with a precision that said something about her mental state. She was preparing herself, composing herself, getting ready to be someone's daughter again rather than a sick child in a stranger's bed. She looked at Elias with those measuring eyes. In slow, careful Spanish, she said, "My father will bring warriors. Many." "I know," Elias said. "He does not know yet what kind of man you are." "No. Some of those warriors," she said, "will want to kill you. Regardless." Elias looked at her steadily. "And what will you tell him?" Sina was quiet for a moment. She reached up and touched the painted beads around her neck, the red and black cord she'd been wearing when he found her, that he'd been careful to leave in place when he'd cleaned her wound and changed her blanket. "I will tell him the truth," she said. She said it simply, like it was obvious, like the truth was always sufficient. Elias nodded. He went back to the main room, sat in his chair by the cold fireplace, and stared at the stone wall opposite. The truth, he thought, had a complicated history of protecting people in circumstances like this. He loaded his shotgun anyway. They came with the first gray edge of light. Elias was already at the gate when he heard them, not the sound of hoofbeats, not at first, but something lower and broader. A kind of felt presence, a thickening of the pre-dawn quiet that his body registered before his mind caught up. He'd learned to trust that feeling 20 years ago, and it had never been wrong. He looked east. They came over the ridge in a line that seemed to have no end, rider after rider, materializing out of the half-dark like something the landscape itself was producing. Painted horses, painted faces. Lances carrying strips of fur and feather that moved in the early morning air. Some carried rifles. Most carried more than one weapon. They came down off the ridge at a walk, unhurried, and the sound of that many horses moving together was something you felt in your sternum before you heard it with your ears. 50 warriors. Elias counted them. He made himself count them, slowly and deliberately, because counting was a way of staying calm, and calm was the only thing he had right now that was worth anything. 50 warriors. He and Samuel had 3 rifles, 2 handguns, and a shotgun between them. The stone house would hold under rifle fire for a while, but not forever, and that wasn't how this was going to go anyway. This was not going to be a siege. It was going to be whatever the man at the center of that line decided it was going to be. And the man at the center of that line was riding forward now, separating from the warriors the way a single note separates from a chord. He was not young. 50, perhaps, hard to say with men who've lived entirely outdoors. He was broad through the shoulders, heavily built for a Comanche, which was a people that tended toward lean. He wore no flamboyant decoration, no elaborate headdress. Just a man on a horse, riding straight, his face painted in simple red and black. But the way the line of warriors held itself in relation to his position told you everything about what he was. The space around him had a quality, a gravity. He stopped his horse 10 yards from the gate. Elias stood at the gate. He had not brought a weapon to the gate. He had argued with Samuel about this for 20 minutes in the pre-dawn dark, and Samuel had not won the argument. And Samuel was currently positioned inside the house with a rifle resting on the windowsill, which was the compromise. Sina stood beside Elias. She had asked to stand beside him, not behind him, and he'd respected that. The chief looked at his daughter for a long time. His face showed nothing in the way that water shows nothing about what's underneath it. Then he looked at Elias with eyes that were as black and still as a gun barrel. He spoke in Comanche. Then, clearly for Elias's benefit, he shifted to Spanish. "My daughter breathes," he said. "Yes," Elias said. "You found her in a dry creek bed 10 miles south." She was 2 days away from gone. The chief absorbed this. His horse was utterly still beneath him, which said something about both of them. Why? The single word carried about 40 different questions inside it. Elias understood that he was being asked something much larger than the simple mechanics of rescue. He was being asked about his nature, his motives, the kind of man he was in the places where nobody was watching. Because she was alive, Elias said. And I could do something about that. Silence. Behind the chief, the line of warriors held perfectly still. 50 men on 50 horses and not one sound, not one movement. Which was a kind of discipline that Elias found himself involuntarily admiring even as his nerve endings were firing alarm from every direction. Sina spoke. She spoke for a long time, in Comanche, in a steady voice, looking at her father. Elias caught nothing. His 3 words of Comanche were useless here, but he watched the chief's face as she spoke, watched the minute changes that moved through it like weather through a clear sky. Surprise. Something that might have been calculation. Something that was definitely pride. Then one of the warriors at the far end of the line shouted something, sharp, cutting, a single syllable of challenge, and 2 others added their voices. The chief raised one hand without looking back. Instant silence. He looked at Elias. There are men here who say a white man cannot do what you say you did without wanting something from it. They're right, Elias said. I wanted her not to die. That's what I wanted. That is all. That's all. The chief was quiet for a moment. My daughter says you are an honest man. She says she looked for your lies and could not find them. I'm not a particularly honest man, Elias said. But I don't lie to children. Something moved through the chief's eyes. It moved and was gone so fast that Elias almost missed it. But he didn't miss it. Then the warrior who had spoken before shouted again, louder this time, angry, and Elias heard the shift in the air around him as several warriors moved their horses forward involuntarily. That herd pressure of men who wanted to act. The chief turned his horse sideways to face his own warriors, and he said something short and absolute, and every man in that line went still as stone. He turned back to Elias. Go inside, he said. We will speak privately. He gestured toward the gate. You. Me. Your man with the rifle in the window. He said that last part without a hint of humor, just facts. And my daughter. Elias opened the gate. He walked back toward his stone house with his spine straight, and his pace steady, and his whole body screaming at him. He didn't look back. The chief's name was Peroa. He did not offer it. Sina said it simply. When the 4 of them sat in the main room of the stone house with the early morning light coming through the single east-facing window, and landing in a pale bar across the table. Elias had put coffee on because it was the only thing he could think of that was both ordinary and not irrelevant. Samuel was at the window. The rifle was no longer on the sill, which was Samuel's own decision and one that Elias noted with something that felt almost like affection. Peroa sat across the table from Elias and looked at everything in the room with the same systematic attention his daughter had shown, which told Elias clearly where she'd learned it. The men outside, Peroa said, in the deliberate Spanish that had the cadence of Comanche underneath it like a current under ice, have lost brothers, fathers, horses, hunting grounds. He paused. They have lost the world they lived in. You understand what that does to a man. It wasn't a question. It was an invitation to be honest. I understand it enough, Elias said. What your people are doing to mine. Peroa looked at him steadily. The army. The hunters who kill the buffalo for the skin only, and leave the rest to rot. The ranchers who fence the water. He didn't raise his voice. There was something worse than anger in how he spoke. There was the flatness of a man past the point of shock, speaking from inside a catastrophe that was still in motion. My people are being killed. Not in war. In the way you kill something you want gone. Elias held the man's gaze. He didn't argue. He didn't apologize. Either would have been its own kind of insult. I know, he said. Do you? I've been here long enough to know what this land looked like before. Before the fences. Before the hunters came with their big guns and their railcar contracts. I've seen what's been done, and I don't have a clean name for it. Perua was still for a moment. But you stay. This is my land, Elias said. Same as it's yours. Something tightened in the chief's jaw. It is not the same. No, Elias said. It's not. The silence that followed was not comfortable, but it was honest, which was better. Sina spoke from the corner where she'd sat down, in Spanish, for Elias's benefit. I told my father how you walked in the heat. 3 miles carrying me, because the riding would have hurt. Perua looked at his daughter and then back at Elias. A man brought her water, Perua said. He put her on his horse, brought her to his house, and sat by her through the fever. And he wants nothing. Nothing, Elias confirmed. There is a warrior outside, Perua said, whose name is Tozabit. He is the best fighter I have. He has killed 11 men, some of them deserved it, some less so. He came here today because he believed that whatever you did, there was a price to collect. A reason behind the kindness that would reveal itself. He's not the first man to think that, Elias said. He wants to kill you, Perua said plainly. He will say it is because of what white men have taken. And that is part of the truth. But Tozabit is also a man who cannot understand what he cannot explain, and a man like that looks for reasons to stop trying. Elias said nothing. He waited. I told him this morning, Perua continued, that we would come here and see what kind of man this was. I told him that if you were what I thought you might be, there would be no killing. And if I wasn't? Perua looked at him. Then Tozabit would have been satisfied and we would not be sitting at this table. Samuel made a small sound from the window. Not a laugh, just a small acknowledgement of the world's specific kind of ruthlessness. Elias put his hands flat on the table. What does a man owe in this situation? To you? For bringing your daughter back alive. Oh, Perua repeated, as if the word were new and slightly strange. He considered. My people do not think of it as owing. We think of it as a thread. 2 people, a thread between them. What you did put a thread between us. What I do next is my answer to that thread. He paused. The dead is not the point. The connection is. All right, Elias said. What does the connection mean? Perua looked at him for a long time. The morning light was fuller now, pushing deeper into the room. Outside, 50 warriors waited with the patience of men who'd been raised to wait, for weather, for game, for the right moment. The sound of their horses was a low, living presence through the stone walls. Tozabit will challenge this, Perua said finally. He will push the others. There is pressure in that group outside like water behind a dam, and Tozabit is the crack. What does he want specifically? He wants your cattle. Your horses. Your well. A pause. Your life, if the others will follow him. Will they? They are angry men who have lost too much, Perua said. Angry men will follow the loudest voice if the loudest voice says what they feel. He stood. He was tall when he stood, broader than he'd looked on horseback. He looked down at Elias for a moment. I am going to go outside and speak to them. You will stay here. He moved toward the door and then stopped. Without turning, he said, When I was 20 years old, a Mexicano rancher found me wounded on his land and brought me inside and kept me alive through a fever. He paused. I never knew his name. I thought about him for 20 years. I thought about what kind of man does that. He went outside. Elias sat at the table and stared at the wood grain. From outside came the sound of a voice, Perua's voice, steady, measured, cutting through the morning air. Then another voice. Louder. Harder. Tozabit. Then the sound of horses shifting, and Elias put his hand on the rifle he'd kept just under the table's edge, and waited to find out what kind of world today was going to be. The argument outside went on for a long time. Elias could hear the shape of it through the stone walls even if he couldn't hear the words, the rhythm of Perua's voice, low and sure, interrupted by Tozabet's sharp, furious interjections. He could hear other voices adding themselves, the group dynamics shifting and settling and shifting again, the way a herd moves when it's being guided by competing instincts. He didn't move from the table. Samuel watched the window. He picked his rifle up again, quietly, without comment, just doing what the situation called for. Sina stood near the back of the room. She had her arms crossed and her eyes were fixed on the door, and on her face was the expression of someone listening to a conversation they cannot control but understand completely. Elias watched her face for information, because she was his best intelligence right now. He saw the moment things got worse. Her eyes sharpened. Her jaw set. Something in her posture changed. She went from tense to genuinely afraid, which was the first fear he'd seen cross her face in 3 days, and that told him plenty. Then the sound from outside changed in a way he felt in his chest, that specific pressure shift when a group of people moves from argument to decision. He stood. The door opened and Perua came back inside. His face was composed, but there was something in his eyes, a controlled urgency, the look of a man who has done what he can do and is now up against what he cannot. Tozabet has spoken for blood, he said. He challenged me, my authority to hold them back. Others are listening. He looked at Elias. He will come to that gate. He will demand satisfaction. If I stop him, I lose standing and the others will fracture. If he comes through the gate, I cannot protect you without setting my own warriors against me. What does he want? Elias asked. A fight? A demonstration, Perua said. He will tell the others that a man who does good without wanting something is a fool, and fools can be taken advantage of. He wants to prove that point. By killing me. By trying. Samuel said from the window, very quietly. He's separating from the group. Coming to the gate. Elias rolled his sleeves down and buttoned them. It was an automatic thing, a leftover habit from his ranger years, something to do with your hands when what you needed was a clear head. Perua, he said. If this goes badly, if Tozabet gets through me and your men follow, what happens to Samuel? Perua's eyes moved to Samuel briefly. I cannot speak for what happens in chaos. Then there's no chaos, Elias said. I go out that gate and we settle it between him and me, and whatever the outcome, it's done. You have not seen Tozabet fight, Perua said. No. But he hasn't seen me either. Sina said, suddenly and sharply in Spanish. Wait. Both men looked at her. She crossed the room and stood in front of Elias. In her hand was the cord of painted beads she'd lifted from around her own neck, the red and black cord she'd been wearing when he found her in the creek bed. She held it out to him. Wear it, she said. Elias looked at the beads. They will see it, she said. Every warrior outside will see it. It does not make you Comanche. It does not make you safe. She paused. But it says something about what happened between us. It says it publicly, where everyone can witness. Elias reached out and took the cord. He held it for a moment, feeling its weight, which was almost nothing and somehow considerable at the same time. He put it around his neck. Perua looked at his daughter. Something passed between them, the wordless shorthand of people who've known each other since before language mattered. Then he nodded once and stepped back. Elias walked to the door and opened it. Tozabet was at the gate. He was younger than Elias expected, 30, maybe 32, but built with a compact, explosive power that read immediately in how he stood. He carried a knife at his hip and a tomahawk in his right hand, and his paint was fresh, applied since dawn. He'd been preparing for this before they'd even come down off the ridge. This wasn't an impulse. This was intention. The 49 other warriors had arranged themselves along the fence line in a long, watchful silence. Elias walked through the gate. He stopped 15 feet from Tozabit. Tozabit looked at him, looked at the beads around his neck, and his eyes darkened. He hadn't expected that. He said something in Comanche, addressing the warriors behind him as much as Elias. Elias waited. Tozabit looked back at him and said in rough Spanish, "You wore that to save yourself." "I wore it because she gave it to me," Elias said. "You can decide what you think about that." "I think you are a man with no weapons at a gate," Tozabit said. "And I think that is stupidity, not courage." "Maybe so," Elias said. "But I've been stupid in worse positions and come through. You'll have to decide if today is the day that changes." Something shifted in the crowd behind Tozabit. Not quite a sound, but a shift. The beads were being registered. Sina had been right. Tozabit's eyes went to the beads one more time. His jaw worked. The tomahawk didn't move. Then Perua's voice came from behind Elias, from the gate, clear and carrying, addressing every man on that fence line. He spoke for perhaps 2 minutes. Uninterrupted. Nobody interrupted Perua. When he finished, the silence was different from all the silences before it. Tozabit looked at Elias for a long moment, the look of a man who has not changed his mind and never will, but who understands that the ground has shifted under him and the moment has passed. The look of a man swallowing something without swallowing it. He turned his horse. He rode back along the fence line without another word, and as he rode, the warriors peeled away behind him, one by one, back up toward the ridge. The rhythm of it was almost ceremonial, deliberate, measured, the departure of men who were not fleeing but withdrawing on their own terms. The last one over the ridge was Perua. He stopped his horse at the crest and looked back at Elias, standing alone at his gate in the full morning sun. 50 yards between them. A decade of war and mistrust and accumulated damage on both sides. All the things that couldn't be fixed by one moment, or one act between 2 men. Perua raised his hand. Elias raised his. Then the chief rode down the far side of the ridge and was gone. The frontier kept going. The Red River War ended in 1875 with the Comanche broken and relocated to a reservation in Indian Territory, their world reduced to government allotments and agency rations and the long, grinding grief of a people who had been everything and were now something else. The buffalo hunters finished what the army started. The great herds that had sustained 10,000 years of life on the southern plains were reduced to bones bleaching in the sun, and men made good money shipping those bones east by the railcar load. Elias Cord's ranch survived. He ran cattle on it until he was old. Samuel stayed for 30 years, and when Elias died, he left the property jointly to Samuel and to Samuel's son, which caused the kind of outrage in Palo Pinto County that Elias had fully anticipated and cared nothing about. He never told anyone exactly what had happened that September morning in 1874. Not the full story. His neighbors knew that a group of Comanche had surrounded his property and left peacefully, which was considered either miraculous or suspicious depending on who was telling the story. Some said Elias had made a deal, given them cattle, passage rights, something. People needed a transactional explanation. The idea that 50 warriors had stood down because of a string of beads and a dying girl and a man who'd walked 3 miles in the heat, that explanation made people uncomfortable. Because it was too simple and too complicated at the same time. The beads. He kept them until he died. Not displayed, not hidden, just on the nail beside his bed, next to the colt he'd carried for 20 years. Sometimes he'd sit in the evenings and look at them. Red and black. The colors of something old and specific that he didn't have the right vocabulary to name properly, but that he understood in the way you understand things that have moved through your hands on their way to meaning something. He thought about Sina sometimes. Whether she'd survived the years that followed. Whether she'd made it to the reservation, or died on the road, or found some third path he couldn't imagine from where he stood. He had no way of knowing. The frontier absorbed people and their stories with equal indifference. He thought about Tozabit too. More often than he expected to. Because Tozabit had not been wrong about the world, he'd just been wrong about this particular moment in it. Men like Tozabit were produced by circumstances, the same way pressure produces stone. You could not simply call them villains and close the book. The world that made Tozabit was real, and it was not Tozabit's fault that it had made him as it did. That thought never made Elias entirely comfortable. But he held on to it anyway, because the comfortable thoughts were usually the ones you couldn't trust. He thought about Perua, and about a Mexicano rancher with no name, and about threads. About how a life is made of them, all the people you've touched and been touched by, visible and invisible, stretching backward and forward through time. Most of them small. Most of them made in moments that don't look important while they're happening, a choice at a dry creek bed, a hand raised at a ridge line. A string of beads passed from one person to another across a distance that should have been uncrossable. The desert doesn't forgive mistakes. But sometimes, not often, not as a rule, not in any way you can count on, something happens out in those hard, ungenerous miles that is something other than taking. Something that proves the country hasn't killed every soft thing in the people who live on it. Elias Cord climbed down from his horse when he didn't have to. That's the whole story. And yet that single, small, unremarkable act of mercy rippled outward in every direction and changed the shape of everything it touched. In the end, that might be the most important thing a man can know about this world. The moments that matter most rarely announce themselves. They arrive looking like ordinary days, dust in the air, heat on your back, a shape in the dirt that you can choose to ride past. What you do in that silence, when no one is watching and the choice costs you something, that's the only honest answer to the question of who you are. If this story made you think about what you would have done, at that creek bed, at that gate, in that room, leave it in the comments. Some questions don't have clean answers. But they're worth asking.